Arratsaldeon eta ongi etorriak Uda ikastaroen eta BBVA Fundazioaren eskutik Donostia Sustainability Forumek eskaintzen duen elkarrizketa honetara. Iraunkortasun foro hau, eztabaidarako plataforma irekia da, ingurugiroaren erronka nagusien gaineko difusioan erreferente bihurtzeko sortua. Uda ikastaroak eta BBVA Fundazioak bultzatutako elkarrizketa saio hauek, aldaketa klimatikoa eta biodiversitatearen galera izango dute ardatz. Izan ere, horiek baitira gure planetaren iraunkortasun eta osasuna bermatzeko guztiok ezagutu beharreko bi gako nagusi. Buenas tardes y bienvenidos a este diálogo enmarcado dentro del Donostia Sustainability Forum, organizado por los cursos de verano de la UPV-EHU y de la Fundación BBVA. Como muchos de ustedes saben, este foro de sostenibilidad es una plataforma abierta para el debate que ha nacido con la vocación de convertirse en un referente para la difusión de los grandes desafíos del medio ambiente en nuestro planeta. Desde la UPV-EHU y desde la Fundación BBVA estamos plenamente convencidos no solo de que el cambio climático y la pérdida de biodiversidad son dos de los grandes problemas de nuestro tiempo, sino de que la sociedad en su conjunto ha interiorizado la trascendencia de este reto y demanda información científica contrastada, así como lugares de encuentro con las personas expertas y con los agentes. Por eso, hemos decidido unir nuestras fuerzas junto con las principales administraciones de Euskadi para impulsar un espacio de encuentro que acoja a la comunidad científica, los decisores públicos, las empresas, las organizaciones conservacionistas, los medios de comunicación y otros tantos agentes implicados en el abordaje de la sostenibilidad. Desde esta óptica interdisciplinar, es un verdadero privilegio poder dar la bienvenida esta tarde a los dos ponentes que nos acompañan de manera virtual para dialogar sobre un aspecto crucial de esta problemática: el desafío de comunicar los problemas del medio ambiente a la sociedad de manera rigurosa y a la vez eficaz. Para aportar la perspectiva del periodismo especializado, contamos en primer lugar con la presencia de Matt McGrath, que desde 2012 ocupa el cargo de corresponsal medioambiental de la BBC, tanto en su página web, BBC News, como también en sus informativos de radio y de televisión. Por la calidad excepcional de su trabajo, que se ha convertido en referencia para millones de personas en todo el mundo, Matt ha sido galardonado recientemente con el primer premio Biophilia de Comunicación Medioambiental, concedido por la Fundación BBVA para reconocer la labor de profesionales que contribuyen a mejorar la comprensión y la sensibilización pública de los retos medioambientales. Matt está conectado con nosotros desde Londres. Welcome, Matt. Para aportar el punto de vista de un investigador.
Hello, and thank you very much for the very kind welcome. I'm very pleased to be with you virtually. It would be much more fun to be there in person, but obviously we know the reason why not. But I'm delighted to be able to take part in this discussion. I'm looking forward to it very much, to speak to Pedro about these issues and to champion, I suppose, the need for good, clear communication on these questions at a time when the world is so distracted by so many other things.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon, Matt. Para aportar el punto de vista de un investigador experto en ciencias del medio ambiente, hemos invitado a Pedro Jordano, profesor de investigación del CSIC, en el Departamento de Ecología Integrativa de la Estación Biológica de Doñana. El trabajo del profesor Jordano se centra en el estudio de la diversidad biológica desde perspectivas ecológicas y evolutivas, con el foco en cómo las interacciones entre plantas y animales modulan sistemas ecológicos complejos. A lo largo de su brillante trayectoria académica, ha recibido numerosos reconocimientos como el Premio Mercer de la Sociedad Ecológica de América y el Premio Nacional de Investigación en el área de Ciencias y Tecnologías de los Recursos Naturales. Además, ejerce como secretario del jurado del Premio Fundación BBVA Fronteras del Conocimiento en Ecología y Biología de la Conservación. El profesor Jordano está también conectado con nosotros desde Sevilla. Bienvenido, Pedro.
Hello, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation to join this conversation with Matt. It's a great pleasure for me. My apologies for not being able to be there to join you in person for this event, but I think we can have a great discussion today. Thank you.
We're sure of that. Thanks so much, Pedro. Como ven, tenemos la suerte de contar esta tarde con dos ponentes de un nivel realmente extraordinario. Así que, sin más, les cedo la palabra para que podamos escucharles dialogar sobre el gran desafío de comunicar los problemas del medio ambiente a la sociedad. Muchas gracias a ambos por estar aquí y adelante, este foro es vuestro.
Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much for the introduction and the kind words. And it's lovely to see you, Pedro, in Seville. I'm here in Oxford, in England, and it's nice and sunny here also today. So it's still a September day. I'm very keen to talk to you about a number of things that have happened in the last week or so. We've seen a surge of information and reports coming out about biodiversity and the crisis in biodiversity. And here in the UK, we had on the BBC David Attenborough, possibly the world's most famous naturalist, putting together a program called Extinction, the Facts. And this went out on primetime TV over the weekend and had a lot of impact. So it seems like we're at a crucial moment for getting the message out for extinction. Do scientists feel this also?
Yeah, absolutely. It has been a terribly busy week with several reports coming out from the United Nations, from other agencies, and also I think a major event was indeed the Richard Attenborough documentary that shows very well how the destruction of nature not only corrodes our souls, our spirit, that we need nature and wilderness as humans, but also compromises a lot the well-being and prosperity of human societies. So it has been a week with very interesting reports that are being signaling several alarms that were already set up years ago with previous reports regarding extinction. And in fact, the disappearance of species and the extinction of species is one of the major threats that we are confronting now as a society, not only in different countries, because different countries are affected to different levels by species loss and biodiversity degradation, but also for the whole planet. I mean, for the whole Earth system, that we are witnessing a real biodiversity crisis.
One of my colleagues during the week, who's a journalist in this, not in a specialist field, just another journalist, an ordinary journalist, to be say, not somebody who's in this wonderful field, but they looked at the Attenborough situation and they looked at these other reports and they said, yes, but the COVID-19, how do you make the link between biodiversity loss and pandemic disease? How do you explain this question? So it's something we've been taking for granted or talking about for several months. How do you explain it, Pedro?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that nowadays it is quite logical that most of the attention of the media and people are centered on the medical or healthcare aspects of the pandemic, of the COVID situation. We have an urgent need for developing the research on vaccines and developing the most robust vaccination programs that we can. But then I see less ground for making reflections on what are the origins of those pandemic crises. And if we revise the history of humanity, there have been hundreds of different pandemics from very old times. So, but a characteristic thing about pandemic crisis for humanity in recent years, in the past, let's say, the last 40 years or 50 years, is that a very high proportion of them have been of zoonotic origin. I mean, those are pandemics originated from pathogens that have somehow jumped from wildlife species to human beings. And when we think deeply about the real origins of these, they are, in fact, what I have called in some occasions a real toxic relationship between humans and nature. So whenever we keep that toxic relationship with nature, we open those doors to the pandemics. For instance, in areas where the forest is, areas are deforested, habitat is lost, animals and wildlife are overhunted, and all those different situations are situations where those doors to the pandemics are open, and we are just living one of those situations. It is not the first, it's not the last, and more will come in the future.
Yeah, that's a frightening idea. I guess, all right, many people, I suppose, can understand that in like marketplaces where animals are very stressed and they're being put close together with other species, that perhaps a virus from one can jump across to the other. Mm-hmm. But the question of them, that virus then going into us and spreading rapidly and forming, some people have obviously speculated that, humans might have been involved in some shape or form, but you're happily confident that, this is a natural event. We've seen this before and we'll see it again. It's down to us and the way we treat nature.
Yeah, that's a very important point that is currently under quite a strong research, and all the evidences point to a natural origin of the virus. There are several other coronavirus species or forms, because with the viruses, we don't properly talk about the species, about linear species. They are somehow variants or micro species or other sort of things that are quite similar to other coronaviruses found in bats and pangolins and other wild species. So this, together with the fact that the details of the RNA sequence of the virus has several specific details that make quite possible that the origin of the virus is natural, but is still under research, of course.
Yeah, I guess we don't want to spend all our time talking about COVID-19 because that seems to be all everybody does all the time these days. But the broader question of the biodiversity loss and climate change, which are connected, obviously, but biodiversity loss was highlighted by the WWF in their report last week, which said essentially that since 1970, we've lost 68% of species. Now, in your work as a scientist, have you seen that in your life? Have you seen that kind of loss? And where does it take us down the road? Surely we can't go on at that rate. Surely, something has got to stop here.
Yeah, the records are really terrible. I mean, if you look at the numbers of biodiversity loss, the statistics are really astonishing. So, for instance, recorded since the 16th century, we have extinction records for 700 vertebrate species and 600 plant species, and that's a huge number of species. So the problem now is that the extinction levels and the extinction rate, the loss of extinctions over time, is several orders of magnitudes above what technically we call the background extinction rate. That will be the level of loss of a species through the geological time in Earth, in the middle, in the interim between the major pulses of massive extinction events in Earth. There have been 5 major extinction events on Earth, starting millions of years ago, and of them, the last 4 have been in the last 350 million years. The last one was in the Permian Triassic event, that where 90% of the species on Earth disappeared, and that was 150 million years ago. It has been relatively recent. Now, there is a strong consensus among ecologists and biodiversity researchers that we are facing a sixth extinction event. And because we have all the conditions for defining it as a massive extinction event. There are three main conditions to define a mass extinction event. One is it has to affect many species in different type of taxonomic groups and different type of biota. It has to be a mortality and a loss of species extended in different components of the biota. Second, it has to occur over very large geographic areas, for instance, affecting to all the planet, or even well above any local scale, or even regional scale, or even continental scale. And third, it has to occur over a relatively short period of time. We have all these three main ingredients now in what is called the Anthropocene extinction event. And because the figures are quite similar to what we found in the species lost in those mass extinction events.
One of the newspapers here in the UK was looking at the global biodiversity outlook that came out yesterday, which says essentially that the targets that humans have set themselves to save biodiversity over the last 10 years haven't been met. There's been some small progress, but we've not been making the big steps we need. But their headline and their story today was "Stop eating meat to save the planet." Now, is it just as simple as that? Is that what everybody has to do? Is that a solution or the solution?
Yeah, it's not the only solution, and that was also advanced last year by the IPBES report, where it is very clear that to bend the biodiversity trend, the biodiversity loss trend, to bend that curve and then start to recover the ecosystem, we need more than conservation efforts. We need to preserve nature, to make new reserves, new national parks, to establish new protection areas, and we need more efforts than that. That is totally insufficient. So we need a concerted action effort. That is an idea that Professor Dame Georgina Mays, that has been awarded also by the BBVA Foundation with the Frontiers of Knowledge Award. She emphasizes a lot that we need the coordinated action between conservation efforts and also a deep change in the way that we exploit agricultural resources, that we consume animal resources for food. And there are several actions that we can take to try to bend and to contribute to bend that curve. Because if we don't have this concerted action, then it would be extremely difficult that we can reach a sustainable biosphere by 2050. Let me show briefly a slide that may help to make the point here more clear. So I hope you see now it. It's okay? So you see,
I can see it.
Okay, you see here, this is a timeline, and it's from 1970 up to 2050 and then on. And you see here a typical trend that we are having, losing the amount of biodiversity, different species of animals, plants, and so on. And here the IPBES and also the GBO projections, they point that depending on the type of scenarios that we take, depending on the actions that we take to protect nature, we can have different trajectories for full recovery or to continuing with business as usual here. And we will never recover nature effectively. Then if we just take increased conservation efforts, then we have this trend that will be completely insufficient to to return to functional and well-preserved ecosystem. Only if we combine those conservation efforts with a sustainable production of agricultural goods and also animal meat and all that, and more important, more sustainable consumption, we can bend effectively the curve, and then around 2050 start to recovering all this biodiversity. So yes, just by reducing, for instance, the share of animal protein in our diets and animal food in our diets to a half, and decreasing that to 40% or 50%, that's one of the best initiatives that we can do
It's a really useful slide. It's a really useful slide to show the decline since 1970. Some interesting factors going alongside that factor since 1970 is the population of us humans has doubled. Yeah. The amount of the size of global economies has gone up 4 times, and international trade has increased 10 times. So I imagine they're kind of connected to all of this. But I want to maybe tease out the question about not just meat, but the way that we look at these things and the way that we communicate this message. Because I've looked at a study recently which has examined lots of climate change reports going back over the past 12 years, more than 120,000 of them that mentioned climate change. Only in 4% was animal production and eating meat looked at as a possible cause or solution. And often when it was mentioned as the individual's responsible. You must stop eating meat, you must cut down. Whereas when we talk about fossil fuel companies producing oil and gas, we don't talk about people filling up their cars, we talk about the fossil fuel companies. So there seems to be like a split message here that when it comes to, preserving biodiversity by eating less meat and eating less animal products, it's our individual responsibility. When it comes to fossil fuels, maybe it's the responsibility of cars and electricity companies and so on. Is there a way of shifting that conversation so that people don't necessarily just feel the pressure themselves, but that perhaps we talk to the suppliers, the governments, that maybe there are other factors involved that perhaps governments can take a stab at?
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. Well, first of all, we as citizens, we have a personal responsibility in the way that we use natural resources, in the way that we live. We can revise a lot of different aspects of our personal lives, and the way that we use transport, for instance, the way that we eat, and the diet that we have, how we move, how we travel, for instance, all that. But it would be completely wrong to translate all the responsibility for getting out of a crisis, planetary crisis like this one, to translate that simply on the individuals. Here, the concerted action for the governments is way much more important. And not only that, also the action by private companies, by companies that they have an environmental responsibility, that if they revise their production protocols, they can also help a lot to bend this biodiversity loss, because they can simply establish achievable targets in terms of sustainability and use of their goods for manufacturing and their production chain and all that. And that would be the solution. The solution is much more with the concerted action of the government. Look at, for instance, not only the Global Biodiversity Outlook published yesterday, that not a single one of the targets that were established in the Aichi meeting in Japan in 2010 has been achieved. Not a single one. And then for most of the governments, no government has achieved more than four or five of the 20 key targets that were agreed in the Japan meeting. So we need to quickly revise all those benchmarks, all those targets, and there is a responsibility for the governments to, in their backyards, to put those targets into their agendas and then confront the crisis. And then, more importantly, even above the limits, the geographic limits of the different nations, we need a concerted action at the world level. And it is quite important to achieve this agreement. So it is plainly wrong to translate the responsibility on individual human beings. We have a responsibility, of course, because we are citizens of planet Earth. But then I think that the policymakers, governments have much more room for action, for effective action, and that has been also demonstrated in the few targets of the Aichi agreement that have been achieved in terms of, for instance, surface and subterranean waters, in the declaration of protected areas. There have been some subtle achievements there, but there is much room for improvement. And of course,
it strikes me as interesting also that we must not see these things in isolation. And while we can look at the targets for biodiversity, it's really important to keep in mind that they don't just affect biodiversity, that there's a very important issue, for instance, like with food waste. So food waste, obviously, if we cut back on food waste, we preserve more land from being taken into agricultural production. That maybe helps biodiversity, but it also protects the climate, because 6% of emissions come from the food we waste around the world, whether on farms, in production, in factories, in our homes. 6% is like 3 times the footprint of flying, which everybody says flying is so bad. Yes, flying is bad, but wasting food hammers the climate, hammers biodiversity. And, I think we need more incentives from governments or from some sort of leadership to show us how joined up these questions are, and how hitting one, you can hit both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly, yeah, the main critical actions that have been pointed out by recent studies, for instance, one just published a couple of weeks ago, if I remember well, in Nature Communications, the authors were arguing for this concerted action that Georgina Mays and others and the IPBES have been put forward. And this is the interwoven actions of for instance, attaining sustainable increases in crop yields by doing better agriculture, doing better livestock raising, more sustainable livestock raising, also increasing trade, but of agricultural goods, so that not so much waste is produced, and reducing the trade barriers that are now collapsing many of the agricultural foods markets in absurd situation. And also, we have mentioned before during this discussion that it will help a lot also cutting by 40-50% the share of animal calories that we have in our diets. That would be very good. And then 2 more immediate actions that we need quite urgently are to increase the protected areas, the fraction and the percentage of protected area in different parts of the world, and make that congruent with the biodiversity hotspots and the areas concentrating the maximal biodiversity, and also increasing restoration efforts. And restoration efforts here, I mean, I totally agree with you that implying not only the reducing the waste of food, the waste of resources, they imply also improving all the recycling industry, for instance, optimizing and also communicating to the general public the need to assume a recycling behavior, and also forcing our city halls and policymakers to provide the ways that recycling would be effective in our cities. That would be quite important. So it is this concerted action between this sustainability of agriculture, livestock, and the actions for conservation of nature.
Yeah, I mean, it's important that we also talk about solutions because, you know, it's a pretty depressing read when you look at the science report after science report telling us that the biodiversity is being crushed and we as humans are responsible for this at the same time as our planet is warming in ways we have never recorded before. So I think it may be a good idea to highlight some positive examples. And I mean, we always talk about negatives, but there are some good positive examples. One I was reading about today was in Costa Rica and in Colombia, where they introduced taxes on fossil fuels back in the late 1990s. Small taxes, but they diverted the revenues that were raised by those taxes into protecting the forests. And not just to the big forest owners, but also to people living below the poverty line. And in Costa Rica, this has really had a dramatic effect in helping turn a country that had one of the highest rates of deforestation in 1980 into a country that is now one of the leaders in terms of preserving its forests. So it's important to stress that there are ways forward and there are solutions, but perhaps maybe, do you think taxes are a good way of achieving this?
Yeah, that could be one of the ways, but it is not the only one. But I would like to also to make a reflection on the issue of pessimism and optimism, and really I think that if you see the numbers and if you see the statistics, if you see the data that are put forward by all those different reports, then the panorama is quite depressing. But I think that pessimism here is much more likely to foster denial, to foster procrastination in conservation efforts, to foster apathy or anger, or even recrimination among different countries and different governments. And I think that it is a type of optimism that we need. It's a special type of optimism that Paul Romer, that is a Nobel Prize in Economics in 2018, if I remember well, called it conditional optimism. So if you are a plain optimist, then you are we are kind of a kid that is just awaiting to receive a wonderful present. We are passively waiting to receive the fantastic present that biodiversity loss is gone. I mean, that everything is resolved. Then the conditional optimism implies a quite different attitude. That would be the attitude of a kid that is thinking of building a very nice tree house on top of a tree in the garden, and then he's looking around for nails, for wood pieces, and more importantly, he's looking around for friends that help him to build a wonderful and very cool tree house. And I think that is the kind of optimism that we need to have. We need a conditional optimism that is consistent with scientific results, that is consistent of what science is telling us about biodiversity loss. The logic and the evidence of the IPBES report, of the GBO analysis, for instance, because that is the best way to encourage the policy action, because otherwise we will be completely lost. And then regarding this optimism, I'm convinced that we are in a position to restore many damaged ecosystems. And you mentioned already different initiatives. There are many more regarding, for instance, the recovery of endangered species. And here in Spain, we have several very nice examples, like with the recovery plans for the Iberian lynx that have involved not only saving the species, but also saving the whole habitat where the species is living, and then taking into account the stakeholders that live in those areas, or for instance, the Lammergeier, or the brown bear, or the imperial eagle, or different wetlands. And so there is a lot of room to be optimistic, because we already know a lot of things about how biodiversity is lost. We know where to concentrate the efforts. We know how to concentrate those efforts. We we also know we have technologies for effective restoration of biodiversity, given that the specific conditions are met. I mean, not always we will be able to restore functional wetlands or functional forest or functional ecosystem, because they are not losing only a species, they are losing also ecological interactions among the species, and they are losing all the functionality that ecological interactions brings there. So in the media, we quite frequently we see the news of loss of species, but beyond the loss of species is the loss of their interactions. There is no species on Earth that lives alone. All the species on Earth are interacting with other species for different things, in mutualistic, in competitive, in predator-prey, in parasitism interactions, in many types of interactions. And this is the framework where biodiversity is supported. And then to restore that, we need those specific actions. And we have already very good technologies to achieve that.
You mentioned a couple of examples there, which are very interesting and close to my heart, and one of them is about wetlands and peatlands. And if you talk to my father, who's still alive, and he's a farmer in Ireland, and if you ask him like some of the best things he's done as a farmer, he will tell you that one of the best things he did, and he was encouraged to do this by the government, was to drain the peatlands, to make them productive, to grow grass, to feed cattle, to make beef. Now, 50 years later, we are telling them to go the other direction, put the water back in the peatlands, to stop eating beef. It's for people of a certain generation, these are almost impossible changes to make. And they require maybe not just optimism, but perhaps maybe courage as well. Is that an essential element here, that sometimes right now maybe we need some push as well as some carrot, some stick as well as some carrot?
Yeah, because sometimes I think that now from a perspective of communication of all those programs, I think that sometimes one of the errors that we have is that we try to give a lot of information, is to inundate people with information and to try to convince them that we are in the right position because we have a lot of information about what's going on in the planet, and then that we need to change all those things. And then I think that we need to change that in terms of transmitting not the information, but the knowledge. That is quite a different thing. I mean, it's way more difficult to transmit knowledge to people so they can develop a critical thinking about what they do every day. So maybe we were talking before of changing our food habits, our way of doing things in the kitchen, or the way that we use transport, or the way that we cultivate earth. But then if we, with generosity and also based with the evidence, we explain the things with great detail, I think we can be quite convincing, especially also if we use those cases, those success stories that we have, and that demonstrate clearly that things can be done in a different way. So I totally understand your point. I have also elder people that I know from the field, and we sometimes have very interesting conversations that apparently are completely confronted, but when we start interchanging ideas and all that, we perceive a lot of approximation.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a good to have that conversation, even with people who don't agree with you, especially with people who don't agree with you. It's critical, I think, for the future, the way that we do this. But as a scientist, you must get, I mean, you know, for me, I mean, my role is as a communicator here. I'm just a rambling idiot who finds some stories and asks questions to people like yourself who know the answers. But you must get frustrated when people in my role when we try to communicate those messages, but we simplify them. And that, I suppose, is the big danger, that we oversimplify them. We make them too scary. We don't give people a sense of hope. We befuddle them with too much information. I guess we commit all these sins.
I don't think the problem is with simplification. I think the problem in transmitting science is in trivialization. Science is very complex. I mean, believe me, you have to study a lot.
I'm not fighting you on that one. I completely agree.
Yeah,
there's no way you can say, oh yeah, the science is easy. There's no such thing. You know?
I mean, technically, it's very complex. So then the great challenge that we scientists have with citizens, with people interested in science, is to simplify complex things in ways that they can be understood. Probably they are not fully understood, because to fully understand a scientific problem, probably you need a lot of study, a lot of hours, a lot of effort, a lot of work. But then if you understand, if we, the researchers, if we understand our business, we are in a good position, and Feynman say that to explain well a problem to someone, you need to understand very well the problem, and then to be able to explain it. So it's not a question of simplifying. Simplifying is great as long as you don't make the point trivial at all, because and also I think that we as researcher and as scientists, we play with some advantage, because science is fascinating. Science is wonderful. I mean, it's very attractive to many people. So many people, even if they know nothing about science, if they find you and you start explaining things to them and transmitting enthusiasm and transmitting how and why you are doing and you are involved with science, then you're convinced that. I'm totally convinced about that.
I think you're right. I think passion is a critical element of getting the message across. There's a few things I would add to what you're saying about not trivializing it, but to simplify it. That there's a few things we can glean from what's been successful in the last couple of years in terms of transmitting scientific information, and that is to have one of the most important things is to have clear numbers. So last year we had the IPBES report talked about 1 million species. The IPCC report on temperatures in 2018 talked about 1.5 degrees. We had to cut emissions by half by 2030. Very simple kind of clear numbers, and also, and very importantly for this type of communication, you have local examples but global implications. So it might be species in Spain under threat, but the implications are global because the causes are global. Yeah. You might have you also need to imply, as you said, the complexity of this. The complexity of science is very hard. You can't just say it's easy. You have to recognize that it's complex and give shade and show the different shades of opinion that many scientists have. But I think also the public wants to hear that there are solutions, even if they're tough, even if they're hard. They want to hear them. And also timing is so important. It's critical right now. We're getting all these reports about nature, about biodiversity after the COVID crisis. The timing is good because, next year countries will meet and perhaps set new targets. There might be a Paris Agreement for nature. So timing, content, complexity, all those elements make a good communications message, particularly in this field. And those are some of the things that I guess I've learned in doing this job.
Yeah, and also another strong point that as scientists that we have is that we usually explore different options for a given action. So in the nice figure that I showed you before, there are different scenarios. And either both the IPCC and IPBES, they are showing us different scenarios, and they are providing us with well-founded evidence, quite extremely well-supported evidence of what are the pros and cons of following the different options that we have. And that's very important. I totally agree also with your last point, Matt, about the timing. You have seen that those trends with the climate change, for instance, with the increase in temperature or the increase in human population, those are not linear trends. They are exponential or even supra-exponential trends. And this decline, this biodiversity decline, is not a linear trend. It's an exponential trend. And exponential trends have two things in common from a technical perspective. One is it is very hard to make predictions over the long term, because how you establish the parameters for the initial conditions at the start of the exponential tail of the curve influence a lot of what happens at the end of the curve. They are quite sensible. It's not a linear trend. A linear trend is very easy, no problem with that. But the exponential trend is quite difficult. It is very hard. So researchers have discussed a lot about the different options that imply this bending of the curves. But then the second thing that we know about the exponential trend is that the timing is essential. And that is one of the lessons that we have learned from COVID, because the first section of the COVID pandemics has been exponential or even supra-exponential in different parts, and there a delay in the decision taking, in the policy making regarding the confinement or regarding other protection measures, even 1 week of delay has represented a tremendous rise in the level of prevalence of the pandemic. So totally agree that timing is very important. So the real challenge is when we are now ironing this post-2020 global biodiversity framework and let's see what in May next year in China, in 2021, whether we change the targets so that they are much more achievable by the governments and the different nations, and we see a real advance because the biodiversity crisis is going on, is in free fall actually, and there is an urgent need for action. Absolutely.
Is there a danger in that, like with the previous targets that were set 10 years ago in 2010, that because there's no one person responsible, everybody lets it all fall? And that if you look at the climate example, how the construction of the Paris Agreement was done slowly, but it involved two of the big powers at the time, the United States and China, coming together and actually, showing the way, showing leadership. Is there leadership in terms of biodiversity, or is everybody kind of looking at their shoes?
I'm more pessimistic about that. Yeah, I think there is a lot of looking to our own shoes and then not looking the whole perspective. And I think that there, for instance, Europe can have a leading role, and I'm not seeing really that position for the European government. But then that said, yesterday the president announced also a quite a strong commitment for having neutrality in emissions for 2050, and then having a serious shortcut of emissions by 2030. So let's see if this progresses adequately towards the new targets that will be most likely set up in the next year. But
you hear sometimes scientists, not scientists necessarily, but politicians will sometimes say, well, look, let's plant more trees. Let's plant 1 trillion trees. Is that trivialization rather than simplification? It's a complex issue of, you can't just solve all our problems by everybody planting a tree.
Yeah, absolutely. Any reduction or any improvement in the policy for instance, for a more sustainable agriculture or livestock grazing will have orders of magnitude higher impact on the emissions than planting trees. And also planting trees and reforesting, we are seeing from a restoration ecology perspective that is not the same as restoring functional ecosystems. And we are now seeing in the whole area, for instance, of restoration ecology, a shift from a paradigm of simply plain reforestation to a more developed and articulated approach involving the reconstruction of functional ecosystem, not only putting there the species, but also being able to reconstruct all this biodiversity framework established around the functional interactions that support those ecosystems. If we do just the plantation, that would be completely, non-functional.
One of the key issues that's come up recently in the last couple of years it's a very important one, and I'd like to get your thoughts on this, is the role of Indigenous people in parts of the world and their role in preserving biodiversity. How important is it, and are we giving them enough power here? Are we recognizing their role here?
At least for the IPBE's report, they were certainly included, the knowledge from the Indigenous people, and this is fundamental because they have a different type of knowledge than the scientific community has, but it can be very nicely interwoven between the two to produce better emerging properties in the whole knowledge that we have about a natural system and a wilderness, a particular specific wilderness area or a specific ecosystem. That is absolutely fundamental. And even not talking about by indigenous people, but also, for instance, in Spain, we have also a debate about the role of rural areas. And in rural areas, the people that live in those rural areas are extremely important in any conservation effort. So it's not just a matter to get there with the precision of a physician to try to intervene in the conservation action, but you need also the support from people living in the area, interacting with them face to face, and then building on top of that. And in fact, those success stories that we have been mentioning before, like for instance, the one with the Iberian lynx, or other very nice projects that are framing around the LIFE EU projects, like the olive orchards, for instance, olive orchards here in southern Spain that preserve biodiversity. All those initiatives have a very strong component of interacting with the stakeholder, not only people that live in the area, and also in tropical areas, other initiatives have been also involving quite heavily indigenous people. So I think this is already implemented. There is always a need for more effort with that, and that is a very important point, of course. Yeah.
I saw a cartoon a couple of months ago, you might have seen it also. It had a number of people on a beach, and there's a big wave coming towards them, and it says COVID-19. Yeah. But behind that wave is another giant wave that says climate change. And behind that wave is another giant wave that says species loss and biodiversity and nature loss. Yeah. Yeah. When you see things like that, it must be hard to keep optimistic that we can deal with all these different waves of stress that are coming at us. I mean, do you remain optimistic that we can deal with this?
Yeah, I think so. We can think that we are good surfers, and we can save the wave, and we can surf the wave if we act promptly and in a coordinated way, and also efficiently, and depending, of course, on the situation. There are some situations where the degradation, the disturbance process on ecosystem has proceeded well beyond the tipping points where the recovery, not only of the original situation, but even intermediate situation, is really impossible.
But you make a very important point here. You are saying essentially there are some things that can be saved and some things that cannot, and we have to be brutal about what we can save and what we can't. Is that fair?
Yeah, exactly. And there are techniques and there technologies that allow us to identify where the system can be prone to one of those point of no returns, and whether we are dealing with a recovery effort where it is possible to recover the original situation. For instance, with the Iberian lynx at the start of the program, we were really thinking that everything was lost and the species would go extinct, and now the situation is much more better. So if we see very large waves, we need to think how we can surf those waves and proceed. But certainly, we were talking about the doors of the pandemics, and that wave of the COVID has behind other possible waves. We need to improve our knowledge about biodiversity. We know very little about the biodiversity of the planet. We have named it around 1.8 million species, and this is a very small fraction of the estimated 11 or 15 million species that we may have. And for instance, for viruses and bacteria and archaea and other protists that have concentrate the potential pathogens for humanity, we don't know around 99% about them. So we need to put much more effort in inventorying this biodiversity and looking, for instance, at the biodiversity of viruses. What is the fraction that really can make those jumps that we were talking at the start of the conversation to human beings? And probably we'll see that if the situations of biodiversity conservation in natural areas, in wildlife, in wilderness areas is at equilibrium, then we are very well protected against those jumps from during future pandemics. But whenever any disturbance processes and serious alteration of nature open those doors for those pathogens to come to humans, then we will be repeating the situation that we are living at this moment. And of course, a fraction of that biodiversity of bacteria and viruses, not all that, I mean, is pathogenic, of course. Viruses have a very important role in natural ecosystem, in maintaining the stability of natural ecosystem. The same with bacteria, fungi, and other microorganisms, the whole microbiota.
Well, let's hope we can keep discovering them before we destroy all the ones that we have already discovered.
Sorry, Matt, I didn't.
I said I hope we can keep our rate of discovery and our rate of knowledge go faster than our rate of destruction.
Yeah, absolutely. We have a lot more to do, and for instance, let me show very briefly, because we are almost finished. But this, if you can look at this figure, we have in this left panel the total amount here in the axis here. We have the absolute number in millions of species that we have already described in blue, and the estimate in that we don't know, the estimate in orange. That is the level of knowledge that we have for biodiversity of viruses, prokaryota, and then eukaryota, the fungi, the plants, and then different type of animal, crustaceans, molluscans, nematodes, arachnids, insects, vertebrates, and so on. And here in the panel to the right is the percentage of knowledge that we have about those different groups. Look at the numbers.
Wow.
We need a lot more to do to try to unveil more the actual richness of biodiversity, and especially the functional role of those unknowns. 99% unknown here, 93% for the fungi, 95% for nematodes, and more than 80% for invertebrates. We need a lot to explore, and then so biodiversity exploration is one of the main frontiers of knowledge that we have to explore. and we need to urgently do that for the well-being of humanity. Yeah, absolutely.
It's a really interesting topic, Pedro. I think we could talk about it all day. It's very, very interesting, but I think we have possibly reached the end of our time. But it's been a great pleasure for me to talk to you, and I learned so much. You know, when we talk about scientists who can communicate this stuff, you know, you're exactly what we need. It's guys like you we need to be able to get that message across about the importance and the threats that are facing and what needs to be done. So it's always, I always feel my spirit's uplifted when I speak to you about this. It's good for me as well as good for learning.
Yeah, thank you. And for me, it's excellent also to find people in the media and in the communication world that have this sensibility, and also that so that we are able to build those interpersonal links so that the communication can flow. And then I think that would be fundamental in the future to establish a successful communication of science, because otherwise we will be lost. And then as researchers, we need to make an effort to try also to work in those in this communication effort, and then not being necessarily worried because science is simplified. We need to make an effort to achieve explanation of science and why it is important.
Totally agree. Totally agree.
Thank you very much for this very interesting conversation. I think that, as Pedro said, the goal was achieved. We are now much more aware of what are the key issues at stake. And you made it clear, and you made it really thrilling. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Look, it's my pleasure to take part. As I said, it's a great privilege for me to speak to interesting people, and hope people learned something about it. You know, journalists get a lot of criticism, and most of it is justified. But you know, to solve these problems needs good communication. It needs good journalism, and we need good science and good journalism. So we need to keep up the good fight.
Right. That's what this forum is for. Yeah. Excuse me, Pedro.
Sorry?
I was saying that
it's also very important that we establish a very efficient interaction between those two fields. And thank you very much for the opportunity. I truly appreciate this. Has been a great pleasure. I very much hope that everything has been clear, and that the main points and the main ingredients of the debate that is very important. And it is really. We have been touching really crucial points, and I very much hope that all those points have been as clear as possible. Thank you.
Thanks to you both. I think that the goal was achieved, indeed. And gracias también a la Fundación BBVA por colaborar con nosotros en hacer posible este diálogo y este foro. Esperamos que se pueda reproducir en futuras ediciones. Y gracias también a todos los que estáis conectados en nuestra plataforma, y esperamos que sigáis conectados en las próximas actividades abiertas. Eskerrik asko denoi, gurekin egoteagatik arratsalde honetan, eta espero zaituztegu hurrengo ekitaldietan. Arratsalde on.